Please join me in welcoming Mary Ann Caw.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, and thank you for being here. What this is about is how we are perceivers and how we read ourselves as readers of perception. It's also about the problematics of seeing and of trying to speak of that seeing. After an initial questioning, because I prefer to start by a questioning period to myself, you'll find some of these elements deliberately naive, and they begin with a re-examination of what it is to be perceptually innocent, and they continue increasingly towards what you might call an internally innocent conclusion. Beyond, then, I think, perception and on the far side of sophistication. This talk is dedicated to what is unspoken and what is often unperceived. Begin with a quote from Arthur Danto in his Transfiguration of the Commonplace. It does what works of art have always done, externalizing a way of viewing the world, expressing the interior of a cultural period, offering itself as a mirror to catch the conscience of our kings. In his Money, Language, and Thought, Mark Schell points out the limits of our institutions of philosophy and criticism, given our vastly troubled relation to economy, exchange, and coinage. Our money complex and our frequent refusal or incapacity to separate the interrelations of coin and paper, cash and symbol, investment and expenditure, are themselves bound up with our production of writing and our theatricalized productions of textual interpretation, with our reading and our perception of all the former. What we institute in our thought and speech and what we're likely to have instituted is bound and limited, even as what we think we're defending nationally and personally is the freedom of thinking and discoursing against what would bind and censor. Any even cursory examination of what it is to exchange words about X or to exchange our views about Y or Z requires hard thought about what it is just to exchange. How do we invest in what we give out, and how do we get it back? Do we get it back in kind or differently moneyed? And more crucial to the topic, is there such a thing as free exchange? And if so, what is that worth? How do we perceive worth anyway? What is the relation of such perception, including the invisible system of the initially visible coinage of exchange, to present visual perception? What does perception matter, after all, in relation to writing, reading, and exchanging words? Which is primary? All these questions in the institutional setting, or then in their freedom from context, can themselves be related to and gathered up into the notion of translation, or the carrying over into and from one side to another. All we can learn about speaking and the ways it is taught, reading and the ways we learn it, seeing and the ways it teaches us, is translated and transported from the side of production to the side of sign, and vice versa, from sight and its constraints and choices to language and its own. How we read both is itself a subject of choice and constraint, of freedom and explicit value placing, of variety, yet of fidelity to certain ends. And now I want to talk about literal and liberal and to try to see them close up. A recent De Gustibus column of the New York Times begins with this paragraph. An unscientific survey of 26 people proves that the vast majority prefer smooth mashed potatoes to those with lumps. Only 4 of those asked said they liked lumps, and only 1 gave a rational explanation. With lumps, she said, I know they are real. This might be taken as the perfect example of the difference between literal and liberal and of its ambivalent irony. Perfectly mashed and processed potatoes along literal lines will not have lumps, for they, prepared with blenders, food processors, and mixers, are thoroughly mashed and depersonalized, whereas liberally mashed potatoes, prepared with a simple fork, show a few lumps of difference, that is, imperfection. As to which is the better translation of the potato in its essential, its transformed and mashed up truth, the lumpers and the anti-lumpers disagree. You will, of course, have figured out that I am a lumper. The proof of the potato is in its eating. The truth of the translation is in its reading. And I think these both prove that in those realms of perception and perfection, it's our attitude to difference that makes the difference. In his book, The Gift, Imagination and the Erotic Life of Property, Lewis Hyde discusses at length the formation, coherence, and endurance of a group when its property circulates as a gift, and the fragmentation of that group when the gift exchange is interrupted or the gifts converted to commodities. He uses Lévi-Strauss's example of southern France, where in some modest restaurants, from the individual bottle of wine placed before each diner, he serves the person to his side, who then serves him. By this exchange, there is resolved the state of tension between the norm of privacy and the fact of community. Then it seems to me to be a liberal, or if you like, inexact exchange. You might give that person more wine than you get back and so forth, and a symbolic one, such as, and it's then the opposite of the kind of exchange that you have when you, for example, give a coin or token for a plate of those famous mashed potatoes. I would be then for inexact exchange of wine to wine and not for giving a token for my potatoes. Now, these metaphors of commodity, translation, and circulation apply to the work we all do in conveying meaning as we see it. I would choose to do so freely and in the free process of exchange with some lumps in, with some difference to make visible the real substance of the thing. A little difference enables a lot of conviction about the exchange. The other option, of course, is to convey the letter of the meaning, wherein no lumps are permitted. We say the conveyance is literal and gets exactly what it bargained for. Here, the well-rounded potato has been exchanged for a heap of undifferentiated substance about which all one can say is it's substantially different from what it began as, whereas it contains exactly the same. But is there not also some difference between the expression of mashed potatoes and the perception of them? We taste or see the result, but the process is already in the past by that time. To perceive the mashing of potatoes is another thing entirely from perceiving the mashed potato, and yet reader reception theory continues to put the stress on how we read that mashed up mess. E.L. Doctorow contrasts in his False Documents two sorts of language: regime language, societal, institutional, or heavily coded, like that of the New York Times, and free or anti-institutional language like that of James Joyce. Insofar as our institutions for the traditional practice of the humanities set limits on the avant of our avant-garde in America, these two languages will always remain in necessary conflict, and they would, even if Joyce were to be taught and received in beginning English classes. The vocal, troubling, and often convincing post-structuralist and postmodern attacks on binary pairs by recent critics touch explicitly, or then sometimes by implication, on this conflict between institutionally guaranteed and controlled on the one hand, and then on the liberal, free, or even loose on the other. That is, by my setting up already literal versus liberal, I'm sinning against deconstruction, but that's all right, I'll get to it. The matter is complicated in the visual domain, as you might have expected, by the conflict between figurative and abstract, the former being in principle as controlled by its obvious referent as the latter is left open to interpretation, and complicated in the moral domain by the fact that individual perception does not, for example, impinge upon community freedom the way that crying fire would in a crowded theater. But the stress of the accent falls upon the difference to which we can never restore exact equivalence, and upon a celebrated undecidability we should rejoice in, both as interpreters and as translators of the visual and the verbal. A flourishing ambiguity in the translation of ideas and percepts permits certain ways of fitting the verbal or visual garment to the thoughtful idea. Perceptual extremes from the loose to the tight betray the uncertainties rife in any interpretative work. Literal or liberal, or hovering between them, our decisions about the perceptual translations we're bound to make and are called upon to defend, about our setting of what we see to what we write and say, and about the interpretations we fence them about with, matter most gravely. What the art of teaching is seen to be, and what the art of seeing teaches, the art of saying has to convey, and sometimes, and only sometimes, vice versa. Now, slippage is bound to occur between right and left, tied and free, referential and open, faithful and liberal, even between meanings consumed and consumable, but as yet untouched. It always occurs between anything known and yet to be known, and cognitive methods, and can only be deplored or then more positively passed on as self-irony, lest the perceptive translator take far too seriously not the translating mission, which is always serious, but the translating self, which is not supposed to be. All teachers and students, readers and viewers and colleagues, that is, all of us, convey something to some understanding, freely or sparsely, as they are open or constrained, depending on their views of, and talents for, exchange. None is exempt from the general title of translator. We translators then, all of us, are the complex and often troubled mediators of a certain knowledge and value, but in an attitude far from certain of itself, literal and or abstract, faithful and or generous to text and to self, stingy with interpretation or liberal. Already yet again, the attitude to this either or pattern in its mutual exclusivity or in its mutual reinforcement depends on our overall attitude toward mediation and translation, even more perhaps on our attitude to perception. It might well be that the second part of my title, Translating Perception, is just a bull. Roger Shattuck, following Coleridge, defines that rhetorical device he calls a bull. It sees us, we see it stamping along right now. It's the confrontation of two incompatible thoughts with an unformulated sensation connecting them, but only with the appearance and the feeling of sense. In any case, the double sense of my expression, translating perception, is already perceptibly perturbing in its deliberate and even arch self-reference. How, for example, can one translate perception, or can one do it? And how can one have a translating sort of perception? Can one have that? At stake here are the essential translatability of looking or perceiving and the no less essential perceptibility of how one brings over and through or translates, as well as the function of interrelations. In both titular cases and in their interweaving in the single expression, translating perception, the perception of what is to be valued and communicated, to be translated, transmitted, and transformed, influences the conception of how the perceiving is to be done. Performance depends upon perception. And here, translation is its mode. Values must find performance or perish. The performance of translation in its literal and liberal senses is what I here perceive as the point of the discussion and why I'm here. I will be pleading then for a translation whose value consists in its very hesitation between what is perceived and what is transferred as the value of that perception, its use value, but also in its real thickness in the sense of Clifford Geertz's use of the term, taking everything around the event and its transcription together with it into the narration. And then too, in the sense that poetry is thick, dichtung, condensing itself and its own account of itself. Lingering over the sense, wavering between several interpretations of initial perception and how to convey them all, we are already participating in poetic thickness, even as we translate into conveyed values what might have been seen as simple fact, what might have been perceived as closed. We want to transfer more than any single A to any single B, something else. Wittgenstein's forcing of the move we have to make and take into account might serve as the hinge of our entrance into perception and into translation as transference and performance. Now I'm quoting from Wittgenstein, which I will do extensively. Imagine you were starting out from a language game with physical objects. And then it was said, from now on sensations are going to be named too. Wouldn't that be as if first there were talk of transferring possessions, and then suddenly of transferring joy in possession or pride in possession? Don't we have to learn something new here? Something new which we call transferring to, end of quote. The very joy we take in believing we hold what we name, possess what we see and understand, depends on how we see. The universe, said Bachelard, depends on our power of enunciation. We may renounce all our possessions, of course, but not our perception, and preferably not our linguistic richness, probably our truest power. A classic example of perception will serve to translate one version of this issue. The observer is shown a cup in which one half of the measure is taken up with liquid and is asked how the cup is to be seen, as half full or half empty. The response half full is usually thought to indicate optimism, whereas half empty reveals a depressive, pessimistic quality. And some of you may have heard that wonderful talk on Paul Klee yesterday, and you saw a dog and a hill, and the dog's snout is somewhat pointed up, And the point was, is the dog rising or is the dog sinking, as our interpretations are in the bog? It seems to me more interesting maybe than the half full, half empty vessel. That is to say, the response is translated into what the psychologist thinks he sees that we see. Naming is already performing in our value system. We need to put, I think, a hold on our performance. In our relation to our perception of that cup, and in its celebrated classic measure, we have to hold both halves, welcoming the hesitation over such a critical decision. To get more in it and more out of it, we want to say that it is both half empty and half full. Why not? And that we perceive it as such, that it must be translated both literally and liberally as both, for nothing is decidable about it. Authority plays no role here and cannot rule. As in many of the examples we live by and test by, the two possibilities held together make the sort of shimmer that Dr. Rowe describes in False Documents, speaking of criminal trials and their undecidability except by arbitrary means. And the trial shimmers forever with just that perplexing ambiguity of a true novel. Now, I want to point to the word shimmer and to keep it in our consciousness. Hayden White's notion that events are to test their claims by the cross-check of two accounts maintains the shimmer and the thickness of poetry, even in our history as in our language. The judgment we make reflects in this, and in every case, on our own value structure and on how free-tempered liberal or how rib-sticking literal it may be. This applies to the visual realm. How do we read this image? What does that say of our own perceptive habits and our perceptual possibilities, as well as the verbal? What does this word mean? How do we carry it over? And what is the equivalent? Now, I want to talk a little bit about the verdicts of seeing and saying. If we're well-meaning, we mean what we say to be, or at least to sound, true. But until the verdict, that is, the saying true, is in, all we have is the words. The seeing, as Wittgenstein tried so hard to teach us, is the use, and we use liberally and literally, generously and skimpily, our saying and our seeing, depending on how we represent to ourselves the reading institutions we live in and the canonizing museums and textbooks we teach others to inhabit as we have. Wanting the best, we train ourselves in seeing and saying what we already value, taking truth from there rather than from some other ground where it would have its ideal and absolute origin. You know, we no longer believe in origins. We can only verify by seeing as an intransitive verb opening out into an unlimited inner space. Wittgenstein discusses, in German of course, the English phrase of practicality and scientific experiment verifying by inspection, finding it external and preferring to it the general and simple internal seeing by seeing. I'm reminded of Tristan Tzara, who's also called Papa Dada, when he was railing, as he did often, against linguistic tight-jackets of verbal descriptions of visual art. Describe a flower, more or less paper flower, understanding, seeing. Now, in every case, whatever decision we make, including our possible decision to undecide, to let be, to hold at least two readings in tension, the fragment we're taking as paradigmatic of our attitude, literal or liberal, can itself be read. I'm using now Roger Shattuck's terminology, and I want to say it can be read as three things: as absolute, that is sufficient unto itself; implicate, part of a larger structure; and ambiguous, perceived as both. By the branching method of always preferring a double function to a single one, and by analogy to our holding two meanings, I would, in my turn, take this discussion right now to be an ambiguous fragment, both absolute and implicate. And so on, in loops and continuous branches. Every stopping point, the nodal or pressure points I'll return to in concluding, can be seen like that half-empty, half-full glass to be either a negative catastrophe of indecision or then a positive contradiction serving as a relay into another mode. I should like to ask, says Wittgenstein, not so much what must we do to avoid a contradiction as what ought we to do if we've arrived at a contradiction. Now, could we not take this arrival at a sensitive or wavering point, this hesitation, this hesitating moment even, the contradictum or the saying against, as a hinge on which to articulate our further speech performance? And that's exactly what I'll do right now. I think then that we could find the same relay into visual and perceptual realm. And some of you will have perhaps read a lot of people, including me, on the ideas of delays and retards and what it is, for example, in a novel, to stop one thing and say, okay, here it turns. This framed point is the point at which everything leads into something else. Let's hold it right here. You read the novel rapidly, say, and then you stop at one point. For example, in James, always take the example of James when you can. Take the example of James, and you hold one instant and you say, look at this for a long time, and then read the rest, if you like, more rapidly. Hold it here. Or in Virginia Woolf, stop this moment and so forth, which she takes from Goethe. A wonderful thing when she says, I must go and say to Leonard, let's hold this moment, it's so fair. Slowing down our decisions, then, putting them on hold, makes room, temporal and spatial, for the thickening or poetization of our perception and our perceptive performance. Here, Wittgenstein's experiments in some of the passages of Zettel teach us about multiple perception, ellipsis, and hinging, as about seeing or saying, entering the picture, he says. And indeed, his tricks try out our picture as our thought. They can be linguistic, conceptual, and perceptual. Probing is to try them at their nodal or branching points. Ambivalence is assumed. It is as if the imagination were suddenly to be stretched. Suppose someone were to say, imagine this butterfly exactly as it is, but ugly instead of beautiful. The transfer we're called upon to make includes a slippage in perception, the stretching not just of the imagination, but of the transfer point. We see where he delays, and just there forces us to rush to keep our consciousness of irregular rhythms. It is as if I were told, here's a chair. Can you see it clearly? Good. Now translate it into French. Now, I want to conclude with what I call a field for thought and to meditate very briefly on several fields and the stages of looking at them. The stages I think of as 4: painting a visual field, painting a field with words, perceiving a word-painted field after a visually painted field, and then making it ours in time. That, of course, that last is the important thing, and you won't see that. It's just implied. I want to illustrate it then by 3 modern fields. Fields for the eyes, and then eventually for the conceptual imagination, taking its space and time to stretch out. The choice is, as life seems, arbitrary. The visual images I want to use, there'll be 3 of them, are in a sense all clustered about, at least in my mind, the verbal image, which I'm really talking about. What I'm really talking about is another image from John Berger, which I'll read you at the very end. Again, it's taken from his essays on About Looking, and it's about a field. So you could call this about a field. Visual though it is, it can become a field for thought. That is, the field that he's imagining he has seen, we haven't, and it's his rendering of that I'm interested in. It can become a field for thought then, this verbal visual field, by a stretch of the imagination, which is what I want to plead for, liberalizing the most literal expression, the stretch of land. I'm choosing this verbal and visual image as located in relation to such works as Guy Davenport's Geography of the Imagination, surely one of the most brilliant books ever written, and in partial response to Leo Steinberg's postmodernist Flatbed. You remember he takes a John's picture and he stands it up and he says, this is, what we write on stood vertically, stood up on end. This bed for reading then, this reading in bed, is what I want to talk about. Now, this one, the Jasper Johns white flag, you see, of course, the signs on the field as doubly semiotic. That is, they're signs of signs. It's hard to repose here in a field already so worked, at least I think it is. The statement is already so semiotically heavy that I find, though intellectual interest it's full of, I find no repose for myself in this field. Second image, Jasper Johns again, the end papers, called end papers, is already marked by difference. That is, you see 2 fields, and it's marked also by closure because it's entitled end, right, and paper, so you know it's about paper and you know it's about closure. It's a heavily programmed field, and I find this to be someone else's visible program, very heavy, even in parody. And so I can stretch out intellectually, but I think not emotionally there. How are you going to see that? Good grief. Okay, that's Clifford still. It's red. It's wonderful, maybe. No, I should rejoice. Okay, I rejoice that you can't see it. It's a red field, and it has no title. Erase the title, red field. I'm just telling you, it looks red when you see it, if you can see it. But it has no title, and that's why I've chosen it. I've chosen it because it's untitled. It doesn't make any claim for entitlement, so it's modest, if you like. I'm choosing it also because it's not green, so it's not natural, so it's a field for the imagination. And I want to go back to Burge's field, which is a horizontal field. I'm borrowing it from him, as you know, to end on. It's textual, but we get right down to it, to lie down in it, and that's what I want to do. What Burge addresses in his invocation to the field is more than the field of sight or even of thought. It is field and shelf, paper and print, and yet nature. It answers the sun with a cuckoo sound, and yet holds out the jaws of pleasure. It is above all intimate, rich, and immensely present. Now I'm going to read you a brief quote from Burge and then end on a longer one, but I want you to remember, if you would please, that I'm not showing you, for example, a beautiful Bonnard or Monet. I'm not showing you, in short, a representational, mimetic green pasture with, the sun and stuff. Not even Van Gogh. Field that I've always known, I am lying raised up on one elbow, wondering whether in any direction I can see beyond where you stop. End of quote. But, and this is the moral I want to insist on, in closing with Burge's image as my text, the field is only lain in when the level crossing is closed and becomes then the space of a minute or two wait. And it's that wait I want to talk about. Another quote, it is though these minutes fill a certain area of time which exactly fits the spatial area of the field. Time and space conjoin. I'll spare you references back to Lessing. I think we've had enough of Lessing. If I never hear the word Lessing again, it's not going to bother me in the slightest. Not a bit. I mean, he's already implicate, so why do we need to keep talking about it? In this space, then, events occur. The space is, in fact, one of waiting. But what is not said in this essay is what matters, not in his and not in mine. For this field of vision, where what happens can be clearly seen and strangely felt, this textual field in which our energies may be newly charged, this field, containing not just a 2-minute individual retard, which I presume is about the amount of time it takes me to talk about this field, but an epic and a collective delay we make together then, is made most marvelously to open out and in. Like the Grunewald altarpiece opening on its hinges, like the textual knot yielding up its unfaithful and violently pure fruit, like the most unfamiliar coincidence in the field of our own experience. Burge's own opening out of the field of sight bears reflecting on, as it is at once literal, precise, and detailed, that field and no other, and yet the most liberal space for vision. In its utter coincidence with what it awaits, it's a perfect translation of what our verbal, visual, and living perception might be at its most free in process. If I call now, in concluding, on its expansive value as being what I least want our criticism to lose, if I judge it to be poetry, it will be understood that I'm calling on a field to translate a language, a field to render a vision, a field as what perception could finally teach us. I end with a quote from Burge, in which you'll notice that I'm moving from the I to the you, that is, from my perception to yours. At first, I referred to the field as a space awaiting events. Now I refer to it as an event in itself. Suddenly, an experience opens in its center and gives birth to a happiness which is instantly recognizable as your own. The field that you are standing before appears to have the same proportions as your own life. Thank you.